On Monday, President Donald Trump welcomed an unlikely ally to the White House.
And I want to just say hello to the people of El Salvador and say they have one hell of a president.
The leader of El Salvador, President Nayib Bukele, a man who has called himself, quote, the world's coolest dictator.
Well, it's an honor to be here in the Oval Office with the president and leader of the free world. We're very happy.
The two men exchanged praise for each other.
He's done a fantastic job, Mr. President.
And they talked about the important role El Salvador is playing in Trump's immigration policy. Because currently, the U.S. is paying El Salvador millions of dollars to detain deportees from the U.S. and to lock them up in the country's notorious mega prison.
We know that you have a crime problem and a terrorism problem that you need help with. And we're a small country, but if we can help, we will do it.
This meeting happened at a critical time for immigration policy in the United States. Because in the courts, right now, there's a battle brewing over the fate of one of those deported migrants in a Salvadoran prison, a man named Kilmar Abrego García. Justice Department officials acknowledged that Abrego Garcia was mistakenly deported from the U.S. to El Salvador last month. And this error has erupted into a monumental legal battle, one that could define the rights of immigrants and the very boundaries of executive power. The U.S. Supreme Court says Trump officials must facilitate Abrego Garcia's return. But the Trump administration refuses to bring him home, and Bukele says he won't help either.
Do you plan to return him?
Well, I'm supposed to be suggesting that I smuggle terrorists into the United States, right? How can I return him to the United States? Like I smuggle him into the United States, or what do I do? Of course, I'm not going to do it. It's like, the question is preposterous.
To be clear, the government has not offered any evidence that Abrego Garcia has ever been charged with a crime.
How can I smuggle a terrorist into the United States? I don't have the power to return him to the United States.
And this standoff over Abrego Garcia's return is the latest test of Trump's willingness to openly defy the courts. From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Colby Ickowitz. It's Tuesday, April 15th. Today, I'm talking with immigration reporter Maria Sacchetti about this extraordinary case and how Abrego Garcia became collateral damage in Trump's immigration fight. And we'll get into other alarming plans from Trump about the possibility of deporting U.S. citizens, something Trump says he has, quote, no problem with.
If it's a homegrown criminal, I have no problem.
Maria, hi. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to get deeper into the meeting between Trump and Bukele a little later in the show. But first, I really want to focus on this case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Who is he and what happened to him?
So Kilmar is a sheet metal apprentice. He lives in Maryland. He's married. He's the father of a 5-year-old boy who has autism and is nonverbal. And he's helping his wife, who's a U.S. citizen, raise her 2 other children.
And he's from El Salvador?
Originally, yes. Kilmar arrived in the United States when he was 16 years old. So he was part of a growing number of minors, underage migrants who were coming to the United States, many of them to work, because El Salvador at the time was, considered quite dangerous. So Kilmar arrived around 2011, and he crossed the border illegally. He says he left El Salvador because gang members of Barrio 18, were shaking down his mother's pupusa business. They were trying to extort her, trying to get money. And they were also trying to recruit him and his brother into their gang. And they weren't interested. The family moved around El Salvador. They tried to escape, they said, but eventually they had to leave one by one. And so he was 16 years old. And 8 years later, he is standing in a Home Depot where a lot of construction workers, day laborers go. And so that's where the police found a group, and Kilmar was there. And they detained them and brought them in for questioning. They asked him about gangs. Kilmar says he didn't know anything about a gang because he wasn't in one. In fact, he had fled the gangs. And so he wasn't charged with anything. But what the police did do is turn him over to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. because the fact that he was here illegally, which he was, is enough to put him in a different kind of jail, immigration jail.
Mm-hmm. And so what did an immigration judge, this was now during the first Trump administration, right, in 2019.
Exactly.
What did an immigration judge decide about his case?
So that's where you're seeing, you have to look at this so carefully. So he's an undocumented immigrant. He'd been there by then for several years. No criminal record, no arrests. So about 1 month after he is detained, he has an initial hearing before a judge in Maryland. And she looks at the record. He'd been given traffic violations and he failed to show up for court. That's a knock on him, according to the judge. And there is some sort of police record, which nobody has seen that I know of, we've asked for it, that says he was a member of the MS-13 gang with roots in the United States and also El Salvador. So it's considered a transnational gang. He immediately objects to this. He says he's not a member of a gang. He says that's not true. But the judge decides to give deference in this case to the police. So she's going to hold him pending a full evidentiary hearing. And at the full evidentiary hearing, where a judge examines the evidence, hears testimony, listens to witnesses, hears arguments from both sides, the judge came to a different kind of conclusion. So this judge said, and he noted in his decision in a footnote, that Kilmar had been labeled a gang member. But the judge found that Kilmar had testified credibly that he had actually fled a different gang, Barrio 18, Barrio 18, and came to the United States, and that it would be too dangerous to send him home to his native El Salvador. And one thing the United States does not do, is not supposed to do, is send someone to a place where they would face persecution or death.
So the final decision by the judge was also prohibiting his removal from the country, right? Because he would face potential harm or death in El Salvador.
Exactly. So the judge granted him something called withholding of removal. And it's actually more difficult to get than asylum. Withholding of removal, you have to prove that it's more likely than not that you'll get persecuted if you're sent home. But that withholding of removal is very specific. He could be deported, someday if someone went back to immigration court and made different arguments. But the judge said it's too dangerous to send him back to his native country, to El Salvador. And he withheld his deportation.
But despite that, tell us what happened to Kilmar last month.
Lawyers for Kilmar say after work, he had picked up his son and was driving home, and he was stopped by immigration officers and detained for deportation. He was on one of 3 flights to El Salvador on March 15th. This was after Trump had secretly signed the Alien Enemies Act, which sent a portion of that group back without a hearing, alleging that they were Venezuelan gang members. But others on the plane were people who had had deportation proceedings or had deportation orders. And apparently the way they interpreted Kilmar's case was that he had a deportation order.
So he gets deported, and now where do we think he is? Do we know where he is?
We think he's in the terrorism confinement center in El Salvador, which is a prison, a sprawling prison that is supposed to be for gang members. And so you've taken somebody who a judge, an immigration judge, found, his life would be at risk if he were sent back to El Salvador because of gangs, and you've put them into a prison filled with alleged gang members.
Now, Trump, as I understand it, is justifying his deportation and his arrest because he claims that he is a member of MS-13. Is that correct?
That is their claim. And DHS, we've asked them for evidence of that. And DHS said it would, be a national security risk to release that information. But, he's been here for many years, not a single arrest. Now, devil's advocates say they have an argument to make. I mean, as what Kilmar's lawyers would say is just put up the evidence then. They can go back to immigration court. They can kick the media out of the courtroom. I don't condone that, by the way, but that's allowed in immigration court under some circumstances. And they can do that. They can make their case. And they can file things under seal.
But so far they have provided no evidence that he is actually part of a gang.
I haven't seen any evidence, zero.
And so Kilmar does have legal representation, and they've sued on his behalf. Kind of walk me through what the legal proceedings have looked like since they first filed a suit on his behalf.
So he's deported, and his lawyers, his family are just scrambling to find out what happened to him. His wife is watching these videos that the U.S. and El Salvador have been sharing online, trying to recognize her husband. She can recognize him through his tattoos, some scars on his head. Remember that after they were taken off the flights, they were, of course, in shackles, arm and leg shackles, but then their heads were forcibly shaved. Within days, his lawyers file a lawsuit trying to bring him back. The challenge is that he's in another country under someone else's power. And a judge holds a hearing on April 4th. And extraordinary things happen there. A Department of Justice lawyer who has been there a long time and represented the Trump administration, the Biden administration in court. He's a career veteran. And he says in open court that he could not explain why the government couldn't return Abrego Garcia to the United States. And he just is very candid with the court, saying he's not getting answers to his questions from the government. So DOJ suspended him the next day for failing to zealously defend the government. But even before that, in court filings in late March, an ICE officer admitted that deporting Abrego Garcia was a mistake. They acknowledged that a court order forbidded it, the immigration court order from 2019, and said it was an administrative error, an oversight.
That taking this man and putting him in an infamous prison in El Salvador was just like a clerical error. And then what happened?
So that April 4th hearing where the DOJ lawyer candidly said, I'm not getting any answers from my clients, the government, the U.S. district judge ordered Abrego Garcia to be returned to the United States. And the Trump administration immediately appealed. And 3 days later, a 3-judge panel at the appeals court literally said, the government screwed up in those words.
Wow.
And they said that the government can and does return wrongfully removed migrants as a matter of course. It happens, and that the government should go and do that. And one other interesting thing in the appeals court, the U.S. government is correct in that El Salvador is a sovereign country, right? And he is a citizen of El Salvador, so it is a delicate situation to go into another country and demand the return of one of their citizens. But the U.S. government in this case is paying El Salvador to detain him and hundreds of others. So the argument in the appeals court was, well, the U.S. government must have a say in what happens to him.
So then the Justice Department challenges the order in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. So now you have the U.S. Supreme Court involved. What happens next?
So the U.S. Supreme Court, they upheld the lower court's orders and said that the judge could order the government to facilitate the return of Abrego Garcia to the United States. The Supreme Court stopped short, though, of saying that the judge could order the government to effectuate the order. And even, Kilmar's lawyers acknowledged this difficulty in court. They said, the U.S. government can ask El Salvador nicely to let him return to the United States where his family is, where he's lived for a long time. And, they could detain him and go back and have some more immigration court proceedings if they wanted to try to do that. But in this particular case, they were asking them to facilitate the return. The U.S. and El Salvador, as you could see in the White House, have very warm relations right now, and they said they could ask the government to do that.
And this was a unanimous decision by the Supreme Court, right, that the U.S. should, in fact, facilitate the return of Abrego Garcia, because it was the United States' mistake that he was even there in the first place.
Well, it was an unsigned order, and so they said they all agreed on the concept that he had due process. To me, the most interesting thing is that the Supreme Court says the U.S. acknowledges that he was subject to this court order forbidding his removal to El Salvador, and that the removal was therefore illegal. They say it very plainly. It's on April 10th in a written order. And that's really clear language from the court.
Yeah. I mean, and the Supreme Court has final say, right? They're the last stop. And so is Trump following their orders? Is he going to start the process of at least facilitating bringing Abrego Garcia home?
Well, I mean, the challenge here is the Trump administration is arguing that there are foreign policy issues, as they have all along. So even though the government has acknowledged initially that this was an illegal return, there was a lot of debate over that Since they suspended the Department of Justice lawyer who had acknowledged that, others in the administration are trying to say that it was all right to return him. But every single court has said that this was an illegal act. But now he's out of the country. And now it becomes an issue of foreign policy. And so, it's not just a question of legality, it's a question of will. And foreign policy, that's something the executive branch has broad powers over. And they're arguing that, what we saw yesterday at the White House, that President Bukele doesn't want to bring him back.
Yeah, Maria, I want to, this brings us to that point, right? This whole legal saga that you laid out has played out over the last several weeks. And then we see El Salvador's President Bukele, come to D.C. to meet with Trump. And they're seated side by side in the Oval Office. And they are asked specifically about Abrego Garcia's case. And then there's some tape we heard at the top of the show, but Trump also says something else that I want to listen to.
And I just asked the president, it's this massive complex that he built, jail complex. I said, can you build some more of them, please? As many as we can get out of our country that we're allowed in.
Trump praises Bukele for the mega prison in El Salvador. And then he also notes something else about, quote, homegrown criminals.
But we also have homegrown criminals that push people into subways, that hit elderly ladies on the back of the head with a baseball bat when they're not looking, that are absolute monsters. I'd like to include them in the group of people to get them out of the country, but you'll have to be looking at the laws on that, Steve, okay?
So, Marie, you hear those comments from Trump. What is your reaction to that?
I mean, as a reporter, I have so many questions about the legality of sending people from a country where they have due process rights. I mean, I can say I've covered immigration a long time. I've never seen anything like this.
After the break, we discuss the conditions of El Salvador's mega prison and what it means if Trump makes no attempt to get Abrego Garcia out. We'll be right back.
I'm Fennett Narapil, and I'm a health reporter for The Washington Post. My job is to cover public health, and that means I'm writing about infectious disease threats like COVID, Mpox, and bird flu, and I'm also holding the federal government and state government officials accountable for how they respond to these disease threats. So when we write about public health issues, we want to serve our readers by going deep into the science and by making sure that what they're reading is authoritative information that's been vetted by experts and written by people who've covered these issues for years. We want to empower people to live their best lives and to protect themselves and their loved ones. And that's what subscriber-supported work does, is that it gives me the time and resources to really spend on a story. When you subscribe to The Washington Post, you support this kind of journalism and the people behind it. I'm Fennett Narapil, and I'm one of the people behind the Post.
After this meeting in the White House with Bukele, it really sounds like there are no plans to bring Abrego Garcia back to Maryland from either the government of El Salvador or the United States. And so right now he's stuck in this mega prison in El Salvador. Can you tell us a little bit about what we know about what conditions he's probably facing there?
Well, I mean, for one thing, he's facing confinement, which is really, besides execution, it's the most powerful thing a government can do to somebody. And that's why we have so many protections in the United States and other countries for something like that. You get hearings, you get proceedings. It's supposed to be just. You can have a lawyer. And we have no idea what basis he's being jailed for. And if he's been deported to his home country, why isn't he in jail? Normally deportees are let go.
Yeah.
So there's a million just basic, human rights questions and legal questions there that, as a reporter, give me pause. But separate from that, he's in a jail where there are allegedly gang members who a judge specifically found pose a threat to his life. So his lawyers have said every day his life is at imminent risk. They fear for his life. This jail is a mega prison. There's shortages of food and water. There's violence. People have died. It's considered a place where dangerous offenders are held. So that's where he is.
And has anyone spoken to him, his lawyers, his wife? Has there been any contact with him that we know of?
We had a recent court filing from the government that said he's alive.
So Trump is obviously, he's created this deal with El Salvador where he's just going to keep sending people there. Why there? Tell me a little bit more about the relationship that the U.S. has with El Salvador, that Trump now has with Bukele. Why are we sending people specifically to El Salvador?
Well, the U.S. and El Salvador, I mean, there's a long history there. They had a horrific war with extreme human rights abuses in the 80s and in the early 90s. And then that was followed by extreme crime. The United States deported a lot of gang members there. The country, it's just a fledgling democracy at the time, was unprepared for that. And so they, for a long time, were known as kind of one of the murder capitals of the world. And a lot of people fled to the United States, and a lot of people fled the gangs. So Bukele is a complex figure. As you're saying, he's very much about taking a hard line. He's created these prisons and made a spectacle of locking up people, shaving their heads. But crime has dropped, and so has migration. And I know a lot of Salvadorans completely support him. The Constitution barred him from running for a second term. He did anyway. And they adore him because now it's so much safer than it was. I mean, when we were in El Salvador a few years ago, we went through one of the neighborhoods that was extremely dangerous and patrolled by soldiers. And we went up to talk to some of the soldiers, and they were trembling. And they had heavy weapons, and they were terrified. You go up, in the morning, and there would be bodies in the street. And we saw all that personally. And this is something people live with. It's an incredible terror that people have experienced.
Yeah.
And he went door to door and pulled out gang members and put them in those prisons. But there's human rights abuses, and people support it until all of a sudden it's your son locked up in a prison like that because he had tattoos and he's not a gang member.
I mean, Trump, it seems, thinks that he can kind of circumvent the legal system in the United States by sending these people somewhere where it is more lawless, where Bukele can just do whatever he wants to people he perceives as criminals or gang members.
I mean, the Trump administration is now arguing that Kilmar is a citizen of El Salvador and that's where he belongs. And they're painting him as a terrorist without any evidence of that.
And so thanks for bringing it back to Kilmar, because I wanted to ask you, the Trump administration is making the case they don't have to bring him back. They don't have to follow the Supreme Court's ruling that they need to facilitate his return. What do you make of the Trump administration's argument that they don't have to?
Well, that is going to be for a judge to decide because it is a complex question, and the Supreme Court acknowledged that in its decision. They said the government needed to facilitate his return and not effectuate it, which is an acknowledgement that El Salvador is a sovereign country and the U.S. doesn't have power over it.
I've heard the words constitutional crisis thrown around a lot in the last, 24 hours, because to an average person, it looks like the White House is defying a Supreme Court order. They said facilitate bringing him back. The administration's saying, no, we're not going to do that. I mean, can the Supreme Court do anything that forces the White House to comply?
That is going to be an interesting question. I mean, you remember during the first Trump administration when he forcibly separated migrant parents and children. That was considered the biggest debacle. He retreated from that decision. But a judge ordered the government to put the families back together because the Trump administration separated them without a plan to restore those families.
Right.
And so the judge ordered them to do that. Now, some of those parents had been deported, but the judge said you have to find a way to put the families back together. The judge had jurisdiction in this country to reunite the families, and he oversaw it meticulously. And so this is the challenge now for this particular judge in Maryland, this federal judge, is she is keeping a close eye on this. She understands the stakes, that Kilmar's life could be in danger.
Yeah.
But she's walking a delicate line, and every day, every pushback is a question of how far the government will go. I mean, obviously the government has a good relationship with El Salvador. They're contracting with El Salvador. They're paying them to detain people. They're going to do it in the future. So that is an ongoing relationship. So a lot of people don't find it credible that the Trump administration says it can't get El Salvador to do something diplomatically.
If the Trump administration ultimately succeeds in leaving Abrego Garcia in this Salvadorian prison, what do you fear that opens the door to? It seems like if they can just make a clerical error and then say, oops, sorry, we can't do anything about it now, is anyone safe from being rounded up and deported to El Salvador?
The immigration system is secret, right? And it's an interesting test of this because the executive branch has such extraordinary powers. The arrests they have been publicizing are of very dangerous criminals, sometimes where the government made mistakes also in their cases, which we've reported on. But that becomes propaganda because they're not telling us everybody they arrest, just the ones that fit their narrative. Mm-hmm. We want to know about everybody so we can put it into perspective for readers. So in this case, the government secretly arrested hundreds of people. He was one of them and sent them into a prison. And the question is, what's next?
Maria, thank you so much for joining us and for all your incredible reporting on this issue.
Thanks for having me.
Maria Sacchetti is an immigration reporter for The Post. In the latest court filing from the Trump administration on Tuesday, Department of Homeland Security officials said they could not get Abrego Garcia out of the prison in El Salvador. But they added that DHS would allow him back into the United States if El Salvador released him. But as for what happens once he's back here, DHS said they would detain him and try to deport him to another country. Or they would revoke his withholding of removal status, the one he got back in 2019, citing allegations that he's an MS-13 member, and then they'd try to deport him to El Salvador once again. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. If you want to show your support for the show and the kind of in-depth immigration reporting you heard here, please subscribe to The Washington Post. Not only is it a great way to help us continue to do this work, but you can now get access to Washington Post podcasts ad-free in Apple Podcasts. Today's show was produced by Ariel Plotnick with help from Rennie Svirnovsky. It was mixed by Sam Baer and edited by Rena Flores. Thanks to Christine Amario. Thanks also to Lucas Trevor and Lucy Perkins. I'm Colby Ickowitz. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.